Hey, if you're a real estate investor, you need to mark March 1st, 2026 on your calendar right now. Listen, there's a murky new regulation that's been flying under the radar, and it's about to change how we do business as real estate investors. You see, while everyone's been focused on the Corporate Transparency Act, the Treasury, or FinCEN division of it, has implemented now 31 CFR 1031.320. And this rule effectively ends the era of anonymous, non-finance transfers of real estate. So whether you're moving property into an LLC for asset protection or you're closing on a creative deal, if there isn't a traditional lender involved, then the feds want a seat at the table. In this video, I'm breaking down the residential real estate rule. We'll look at the subject to side, the seller financing, how they're primary targets for federal oversight, and I'll show you the exact steps to stay compliant and invisible when transferring your property into an entity. All right? Let's dive in. Okay, so investors that I've been talking to that have heard about this or saw my earlier video that I posted last year on this proposed regulation, a lot of people are getting tripped up over this non-finance definition. Now, what does that mean? You see, a transfer is reportable if it is non-finance. And when I say reportable, that means you have to report to FinCEN the parties involved in the transaction. Now, more on that later. So here's what FinCEN defines as a transfer that is non-finance. It's one that does not involve a loan from a financial institution with a formal anti-money laundering program. So if your loan doesn't come from a regulated bank, let's just say Wells Fargo or Chase, then it's considered to be non-finance. So that means private money deals, okay, hard money, all cash, even, $0 transfers are reportable. If there's no bank involved to vouch for the funds, FinCEN wants to know who's involved in the transaction. Okay, now the government isn't worried about commercial property. This only applies to residential property. All right, that's one thing to keep in mind. So what is residential property in their eyes? Well, that's anything from 1 to 4 unit build. Okay, so if you have any property, say it's a duplex, that's going to get picked up under this reporting regime that they're now putting into place. So when I say reporting, what am I referring to? Well, look at this. So let's assume that you have a piece of property right now and you decide, hey, you want to transfer that property into a limited liability company. So generally speaking, before this goes into effect, what you could do is you could just deed your property into the LLC and you didn't have to report this transaction to anybody, all right? So this is my home, I'm right here, I'm the owner, and I happen to be the owner of the LLC. That's a non-reportable transaction. The government has never collected this type of information that's about to go in effect on March 1st. Now, this transaction that real estate investors have used for 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 years is now going to have to report information. When I say report information, what type of information are they looking for? They're looking for information on the transferor and the transferee. So under the new rules, what's going to happen is you're going to report the name, address of this individual that moved the property to that LLC. So your information will then be reported to FinCEN. Now, on the other side of that transaction, they want to know all the information about this limited liability company. So what that means is they're going to ask for the LLC, who is the owner of the LLC. And so in determining or providing information on the owner, they're going to ask for you to provide a driver's license or a passport. Of course, that includes both your name, date of birth, etc. They want to know your residential address, and they want to know the source of funds, if any funds were used in this transaction. So what is this telling you? I mean, don't think for a minute that this is just another boring form that you're going to have to fill out. This is actually a digital fingerprint, right? Basically on your entire net worth, because as you transfer more property, the government's going to know what you own. And for the first time in American history, they're linking all of your assets back to your social security number, which then goes back to your home address, to specific parcels of land, specific bank accounts. I mean, this is just crazy. If you value your privacy, then this is the ultimate scary scenario, because they're not just tracking the deal, they're actually tracking you. So this is my problem right now with the law the way it's written, is that the strategies that I was using in 2025 and earlier, I've actually thrown those out. And going forwards, we need to look at a different strategy, one that actually avoids a reporting requirement. Now, lucky for you, there is a way around this, and I'm going to share that with you in just a second. But I still want to hit on the point that I shared earlier, that in this type of transaction, because there was no bank involved, that's why it's reportable. So understand, hey, let's assume that you have this person over here and she wants to sell you a house, and you set up an LLC to buy the house, and you go out and you obtain a DSCR loan. Now, I just threw out a DSCR loan just because that's how you would have to close if you want to close in a limited liability company. So if I set up my LLC and I want to close with a DSCR loan so I can close in the LLC, so the property is now deeded to the limited liability company, that's not going to get reported because I have a lender here that is involved in the transaction. So that's a non-reporting type of transfer. Now, contrast that to a situation that a lot of real estate investors are involved in besides just transferring your own property. Let's say you find a homeowner right here, and that homeowner is going to sell you this property subject to, all right? So you're buying this property subject to the underlying mortgage. That is a reportable transfer right now. So when you transfer that property into the LLC, you're going to have to report on that transaction. Listen, you don't want to screw this up because there are huge penalties that come with this, possibly even jail time. Okay, so that becomes an issue for us. Now, my concern for you subject to investors with this type of transaction is that now if this is going to get collected by FinCEN, how much longer do you think it's going to be until the banks start having access to this and they start matching this up? So people are investing subject to, all of a sudden that's going to be a way for the bank to determine whether or not the underlying borrower is still the owner of that property, and they'll start blowing these types of deals up. So another scenario, if it's not subject to, here's another perfect situation. So now we have a creative financing strategy. A lot of real estate investors learn about this and implement this. So you're doing an owner carry. Okay, so the owner is carrying the mortgage, right? When you're setting up this type of deal. So there again, we have a transfer. Now there is a loan on the property associated with this transfer, right? As you obtained, the seller is the one carrying or loaning you the money essentially when they do a seller financing deal, owner carry deal like this. But the seller is not a financial institution with anti-money laundering, blah, 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 blah. So you have to report on that transaction as well. So that it becomes a reportable transaction. So a lot of these situations that real estate investors have used, right, to protect their real estate, to transfer the property into an LLC, all those now are going to start getting reported. And the way I see this is a backdoor into the CTA, because the whole problem we had with the Corporate Transparency Act is disclosing information on our business entities. And luckily they pushed back, we pushed back enough, and they did not implement that for domestic entities. But here we are now, March 1st of 2026, we're going back to the CTA, not directly, but indirectly. By transferring property into the LLC, you now trigger a reporting requirement on the limited liability company, which then discloses all of your personal information. So the question then becomes, how do you get around this stuff if you don't want to use a bank? Well, it's actually quite simple. And what you need to use is something that we've been working here at Anderson ever since I started this firm 27 years ago. We use this specific type of entity for real estate investors. And now, like I said, I'm using it going forwards in 2026. This is the first step that all real estate investors need to take when they're transferring their real estate. And that is to use this entity right here. It is a land trust. Now, I'll explain to you why you have to use this type of trust. So, here's a scenario now. This is me, okay? And I've set up my own trust where I'm going to be the beneficiary of this trust. And I'm going to now deed the property from my name into the land trust. Now, this transfer right here does not have financing on it, right? Just like I did with the LLC. Remember this one down here I showed you earlier? If I transferred the property into the LLC, this was reportable, okay? This is not reportable. See, what FinCEN did is they carved out a little section, exemptions, under the new regulation that allows for transfers into I'll write it down here, grantor trust, okay, where the transferor is the grantor. So as long as this person here is the grantor of this trust, then it's exempt. Now that is the only requirement, that this person needs to be the grantor. So what does that mean? It means that when you set up this trust, okay, that is, you set it up, you're the one establishing the trust, and you're the beneficiary. Simple as that. You set up a trust in which you're the beneficiary and you're the one establishing that. If you do that, then you've satisfied the exemption. So this is why a land trust is now the entity of choice for all real estate investors here in 2026 for property transfers if you want to avoid any reporting. Now I'll come back to the subject to deals in just a moment. So in this type of deal, what you're going to do is you're going to set up your land trust. And if you watch my other videos, you'll know that you have to have a trustee. So who is going to be your trustee of your land trust? Well, you don't want to be the trustee on your own land trust, because if you're the trustee, then you lose one of the major benefits of using a land trust, and that is anonymity. So you want to use either a Wyoming LLC, set up a Wyoming LLC down here because Wyoming is anonymous, and then that serves as your trustee. Or use a nominee trustee. Use someone else over here as your nominee trustee, they resign, and then you step in. I prefer you to use the Wyoming LLC because that keeps you in complete control the entire time. Now, this is a standard situation. So what I just drew for you is for those of you investors that are watching this right now that have real estate or are going to be acquiring real estate, you're closing in your own name because maybe you're financing it with conventional mortgage or however you have it, and you want to move it into a structure for asset protection. Your new path, understand this, if you do not want to report, here's how you move your real estate now. Move it first into a land trust. That's step one. Okay, this is step one. Okay, move it into a land trust. Now, you're the beneficiary of that land trust right here. Step two is to have your LLC set up, and you need to now assign your beneficial interest of the land trust to your limited liability company. And if you've been following any of my videos, you know that that LLC should be owned by a Wyoming LLC, just like this. So now you transfer your land trust into the LLC. Now here's something I want you to pay attention to. This assignment right here is not reportable. You see, I was shocked when I read through the new regulations, and I read them from top to bottom, looking for ways to work around this so you don't have to report anything. It became evidently clear in my reading that the only transfer that the federal government is tracking is this transfer right here. They do not transfer what happens to the trust. So you can move the trust to a third party. You could sell it to them, okay, on owner carrier or seller financing. Sell them the land trust that has their property. That doesn't get tracked. Now, I hope you just picked up on something there, okay, because I'm telling you a strategy now for those of you that are involved in seller financing and subject to how you have to start thinking about these deals going forward. Okay, so if that doesn't get tracked, that leads me to seller financing. So if you find a deal that you want to seller finance where the owner is going to carry back the contract, how are you going to structure these deals to avoid reporting? Well, it really comes down to whether or not you've got a good relationship with that seller and you can convince the seller of this, because it's going to be a bit of an uphill or it's going to be a bit of a challenge for you, I think, to get the seller to understand this. But if you can, it's great, because here's what happens. Now think about it. Here's what I would tell the seller. Listen, do you want the government to know that you just transferred property to me? Do you want to report on that? Because you're going to be bound to report unless we can structure it another way. And I am sure that a lot of sellers are going to be looking at this and thinking, yeah, I don't want to report. I don't want the federal government up into my property sales and knowing about where I live and who I transferred it to and all of that. So make that part of the pitch to do this strategy. And the strategy is as follows. set up your land trust set up a land trust. And what you want to do in this land trust scenario is the grantor is going to be the seller. The beneficiary is the seller. The trustee is your LLC. Okay? That's how you structure this. Okay, now that's step one. Okay, when you're buying property with seller financing. So the seller now will deed the property into a trust where they're the grantor and beneficiary. So you have them set up a trust, transfer it in. Now that it's deeded into there, remember, this right here is the only reporting transaction. Now, once it's inside of the trust, okay, then what we're going to do, because you don't own it yet, you're just the trustee, you don't own the actual property yet, you then need to have the seller transfer you or sell you the beneficial interest. So this is where my LLC comes into play. So I have my LLC right here that's going to be the beneficiary of the land trust. And again, that's for asset protection. That's not what this video is about. I've got plenty of other videos on that strategy. So now you're going to transfer that beneficial interest from the seller into your LLC. And the reason we're doing this is so that I can enter into a seller finance transaction without having to report on that deal. Seller doesn't have to report. I don't have to report because I use this as a blocker entity here to avoid the reporting. So this is a great strategy right here for you that want to do seller financing. Now, subject to, same thing. If you're buying property subject to, all right, so you set this deal up here, and I'm going to buy this property subject to, and they're going to transfer property into a land trust, just like we do with seller financing. Your subject to transaction needs to look the exact same way. The seller first needs to move the property in, so the seller is the grantor, okay, is seller, and the beneficiary is seller. Now, here's what's different with this transaction versus some of my other videos that I've talked about in subject to deals, how to set them up. And I want you to pay attention here. Okay, it's right down here. So generally speaking, the way I used to teach this is as follows. Okay, you got a subject to deal, you transfer it into a land trust here. Okay, and where does the seller show up in this land trust? The only place the seller would show up in this land trust is as a trustee. Okay, we're going to make the seller the trustee, the initial trustee, and then they resign. Now, why did we do this? So that it doesn't alert the bank to the fact there's been a property transfer, and then the bank steps in and sees that the seller is no longer the owner, and they accelerate the note. So we were working around that problem. Now we have another problem on top of that, and that is this issue right up here, the FinCEN regulation. So now what we need to do is not only make the seller the beneficiary, the seller is also going to be the trustee, is going to be the seller. All right. So they're in all three positions. So in this case now, just like we did with this scenario on buying property with seller financing, we then have the seller transfer us the beneficial interest to our LLC, and we go through that same process again, like we did earlier. So that is how you're going to want to structure those types of deals going forwards. Okay, if you're transferring property into a land trust that you've set up and you're using a title company to assist with the transfer, do this. Make sure they understand that this is your trust, because if you're setting the trust up with the Wyoming LLC as a trustee and you're transferring it in, the title company might assume that this is a reportable transfer. So if you don't want to get caught up where you have a title company reporting on a transaction that is not reportable, you have to be diligent in making sure they understand the type of transaction that we're involved with here. Okay, that it's not reportable, because I can see a lot of problems coming up in the future, because I've dealt with title companies and many times I'd rather be safe than sorry is their approach, and they don't care that it's your information that's being disclosed to the federal government because they don't want to get into any problems. Now, if you're wondering, hey, Clint, I don't really care about this, and I'm just going to continue on using limited liability companies the way I have, and I'm not going to report. Well, think again, because if you do get caught, the willful failure to report, here's what you're looking at. You're looking up to $278,000 per violation, right? Let's assume you transfer 5 properties next year and you're caught doing this because you transfer them directly into an LLC. That's $1 million potential dollars in fines. Really, do you want to go down that road? On top of that, there's criminal penalties, up to 5 years in federal prison. So putting your head in the sand is not a strategy, right? It's a fast track to an orange jumpsuit, if you ask me, when it comes to this law. So make sure you're doing it the right way. When you're setting everything up using trust, and you're going to be in a better situation. In fact, the trust just by itself, the fact that you get the anonymity, that's the way to go. You stay 100% compliant with FinCEN. It's 100% legal, and it 100% keeps you off of anybody's radar. Guys, I hope you like this video. If you know real estate investors out there that are not aware of this, make sure you share this video with them and let them know that this is something they have to be aware of starting March 1st of 2026. And I wish you all the very best with your investing.